Welcome to week 4 of the NFL season. We, of course, are Jim McCormick and Ricky Sanders bringing you the videos for this week. It's been a productive 3 weeks for us, but before we get started, we want to tell you about some awesome things going on rotocurve.com. Please use promo code CURVE to save $2 on a weekly membership. What does a weekly membership get you? You get exclusive position rankings, projections, premium cheat sheets, must-have DFS tools like DVP, points per attempt, red zone utilization, that kind of stuff. You get optimum lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel. You get access to player ownership percentage. So please use promo code CURVE. You only pay $5 instead of $7 for weekly memberships. You can't beat a deal like that. But Jim, what kind of deals you got for us at quarterback this week?
All right, at quarterback, I actually don't love this week at quarterback so much because a few of my favorite plays are on these earlier lineups. I think Dalton. I think it's due for a pretty big correction. So if you're playing the Thursday slates, that's not too bad. But we prefer to talk about the Sunday action here just because, by the time this gets published and gets promoted, there's not a whole lot of lead time. So in theory, if you're playing Thursday night, I like Dalton there. Last year he was 4th in touchdowns per attempt, and now he's 31st. So there is a correction coming, even though there's a personnel reasoning behind this. There's a correction on the way for him. But really, for the week, I like Rivers at home here. I think it's fairly chalky, if not the chalk, just because, we all saw what Matt Ryan and the Falcons were able to do against the Saints. We're basically always able to see how easy it is to score on the New Orleans Saints. So it's basically the chalk matchup. They're the team you chase. Other than him, it's going to be Stafford's too close in pricing for me to Rivers, and I prefer Rivers at home there. So the other option for me would be Kirk Cousins. I like Kirk Cousins at home against this Cleveland defense that's highly exploitable. Cousins has the most passing yards in Redskins history through 3 games. Not like that offers us too much promise, but the idea being this isn't a running offense, obviously. It's one predicated to pass. So those 2 guys, I think, have fairly high floors sitting at home against bad secondaries.
Yeah, I just want to expand on Kirk Cousins because I think his matchup is pretty damn similar to Tannehill's last week against the same team, where we're talking about a guy whose running game has pretty much failed him, so they've gone to the pass pretty much by default. I mean, Matt Jones really hasn't done anything. And I think Kirk Cousins is due. You were talking about a positive regression. This is a guy who's thrown the ball the second most times in the red zone. I think it's 23 attempts. He's only completed 7 of them, and he has 1 touchdown. So, there just has to be better days ahead for Kirk Cousins. I think him and Jordan Reed finally get it going this week. Reed's been targeted a ton. He's played 80% of the snaps. So I'm with you. I think if you're spending down a quarterback this week, it's Kirk Cousins. But this is just a really weird, strange quarterback week where I think I'm willing to pay up again because Cam Newton against Atlanta is just so above and beyond the pack. Now, you look at his numbers last year, and he had a 15 fantasy point and a 23 fantasy point game against them. So people are going to look at that and, pretty much avoid. But this Atlanta defense is so bad this year. I don't think you can compare apples to oranges. It was a different unit. They just look horrendous. So I think Newton with his feet, with his arm, I mean, this guy could have, a 23-point floor in this game. So I think for cash games where there's kind of a correlation this week between the poor quarterback play and the poor receivers, I think it is a week you could spend up at quarterback and kind of just take your edge where you can get it and move on from there. But there are some other options that I like this week. I would prefer Carson Palmer if Michael Floyd were healthy. He's dealing with a concussion now, but I think the Rams are a little more susceptible to the pass than they've shown this far. You kind of talked about Matt Stafford in tournaments. I just think this Bears secondary is bad. It sounds like Kyle Fuller is going to be out for an extended period of time. So that certainly hurts the Bears. If you thought they had any chance of containing Marvin Jones, that pretty much goes out the door. So that connections back in play. I also think Riddick's due for a big week. He's had 2 terrible matchups, so I think Stafford finds him here. And then if we're going into tournament play, really the only other guy I like is Trevor Siemian, who's got kind of a nice matchup. He kind of showed me something last week, throwing those I think it was 4 touchdowns. And now he faces a Tampa Bay team that ranks 5th in fantasy points allowed. They've allowed 839 yards passing. And while we think that C.J. Anderson's the focus of this offense, it's pretty clear as of last week they're willing to kind of ride this guy with their talented receivers. So for a cheap price, maybe people think he's a 1-week wonder. I don't think that's the case. I think Siemian looked pretty good. And I think he's a guy that I could go to in tournaments. Is there anyone else that you like for tournaments? Because we kind of discussed your 2 cash game guys.
Yeah, we talked about pre-show. The idea that echoing.
No, okay. You're good.
We talked pre-show. It is echoing for me though. But either way, let's keep going. We talked about Dak before the show a little bit. You're not really on Dak. He's a guy that I am considering a little bit more than you. There's a few reasons. I mean, one, it's just the pace of that game can be up. The other idea being, I don't know how much he really Dez is an important part. Dez Bryant, to give this some context, has been ruled out for at least a week. We're expecting possibly multiple weeks with that, mysterious knee injury that they kept working on the MRI. But here's the thing. Dak has been accurate. They've kept it short, but it's not so short. I mean, whereas like Carson Wentz is 28th in average depth of target, Dak is 12th. He's averaging 8.1 air yards per attempt. He does air it out enough for me to be interested, and also just the legs. That's really what it is that I'm interested in the promise of a guy who can run. For that same reason in tournaments, I actually don't mind Tyrod Taylor. He had one huge game last year against the Patriots. The other game was kind of so-so, maybe 14 or 15 DFS points. But the other one, that first one, I guess it was his breakout in week 4 last year. It was a slate shifter. It was like, that's a tournament-winning outcome. And then even last week, he didn't even play well. And we're still talking about a valuable fantasy performance because he ran for, 76 yards. So the other thing being the Patriots only pressure the pocket, 22% of the time. That's 9th worst in the league. So he could have time to operate. And again, kind of like the Sammy Watkins thing, comparing it to the Dez thing, he doesn't really rely on any one receiver so much as it is his legs and his ability to get the ball deep. And they still have speedsters there. So purely tournament plays. One question I had for you was, who's going to start for Chicago? And this Detroit defense has given up a ton of points. Is there any thinking that you'd go tournament-wise on whoever starts for Chicago?
I would assume it's going to be Hoyer. With that being said, I think you could because the Detroit defense is so bad. I mean, the fact that he found Zach Miller as kind of his guy last week was encouraging. The fact that they kind of started to work in Kevin White, I think it's kind of forming as an offense where he can go to more than just one guy and lob the ball to Alshon Jeffrey like we saw in that first game when he came in. So I think if he's willing to use all of his guys, the Bears are certainly going to get behind. He's certainly going to have opportunities to throw, and he's cheap. The question is, does he have the talent to even, get to 300 yards and 2 touchdowns playing from behind the whole game? And that's really my worry with him. I mean, he is a very capable backup, but I don't know. Are you willing to take that shot in tournaments? I guess I could throw a one lineup with him because no one will be on him. I just don't know if he has enough talent to win $1 million or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just purely contrarian. If you're going to do multiple lineups and you're playing around at quarterback with the same spine of skill players. But yeah, I'm just interested because 1, you're a Chicago guy, and 2, he had a pretty cheap, quiet 23 fantasy points last week, and we saw him have a number of those kind of games for the Texans last year. So just kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think if you get 23 fantasy points out of him, you're ecstatic, and that really puts you in a good spot. So I think if that's what your goal is, And I think that's probably the high end of his outcomes, even though it's a great matchup, obviously, against a team that's been horrendous against quarterbacks. But as long as that's your expectations, spending down for a guy, I think you can get that. But I want to comment a little bit on Dak, the fact that I would have liked him because he kind of has the same skill set as two quarterbacks who's just been pretty good against the Niners. Russell Wilson couldn't really run. He only rushed one time, but Newton was a guy who put together a pretty big game against the Niners. I think Prescott, if he had Dez Bryant, I kind of would have expected the same thing. Now I think you got to downgrade the projection. Not that, Dez was lighting the world on fire or anything, but I worry about a young guy without his top option, and the fact that they felt good enough to give Elliott 30 carries last week. So that worries me a little bit. But the only other guy I wanted to talk about is Ben Roethlisberger in a tough matchup. The fact that they're 5.5-point favorites against Kansas City at home, I kind of liked them last week against the Eagles, and they got absolutely destroyed. And I think you look at those Chiefs numbers against quarterbacks, they've allowed the second fewest fantasy points. I think that's a little bit of a hoax at this point because, Fitzpatrick threw those 6 interceptions last week. They played the Texans the week before, so they don't really have a good sample against quarterbacks this year. They did lose Sean Smith, who finally played well last week. But last year they were more, bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So it is a difficult matchup. But with Le'Veon Bell back, there could always turn a screen into a long gain. He's obviously got Antonio Brown, and they're going to be pissed. So at home against the Chiefs, I think is a decent spot where no one's kind of looking because it looks like a really, really, really tough matchup, and I think it's only a kind of tough matchup. So I do think that's a little bit of a discrepancy between, public perception and the way the matchup actually is. Is there anything we missed at quarterback at all?
No, that Ben pick is interesting. I think there's even a contrarian angle for Alex Smith if that does become a game where he has to pass more, only in the sense that his floor was actually really high last year. He also runs, and the Steelers have the lowest pressure rate against opposing quarterbacks. It's like 10 or 11% of dropbacks. It's really they've 1 sack on the year, so there's just no pressure right now. So. Again, contrarian, I wouldn't throw in many lineups with Smith, but it's a guy who actually I was looking at for one of the higher floor kind of cheap guys.
All right, so let's go with our favorites. Your favorite cash option, your favorite tournament option to close us out.
All right, favorite cash option is Phillip Rivers at home. I just, the highest point total of the week. I know he has some depleted targets, but really I'm just going against this Saints setup whenever I can. I even think that, the fact that they're going to run a lot with Gordon doesn't really throw me off here. I think a nice stack with maybe even Hunter Henry or Tyrell Williams could be really affordable and let you pay up elsewhere. And then in tournaments, I'm going to actually say Tyrod Taylor. I prefer him more than Dak just because I think there is more of an incentive to rush and there's more designed rushes for him. So if he can get 200 in the air and 60 in the ground, you're talking about a 20-point fantasy day for really cheap.
Yeah, I think my favorite for cash is kind of a mix of either Newton or Cousins. I haven't started doing lineups yet, but if I need that extra money, I'm pretty comfortable moving down from Newton to Cousins in tournaments. I want a lot of Cam Newton. I think he's probably the highest scorer at the position this week. If I can't get him, I really like Stafford and I really like Simeon. So those are my favorite options. That's all for this video. But before we go, don't forget to use promo code CURVE to save $2 on a weekly premium membership. What you get: rankings, projections, cheat sheets, DVP rankings, points per attempt, utilization, and tools like that. Optimize lineups. So again, use promo code CURVE and pay $5 instead of $7 for your weekly membership. Stay tuned as we will be doing running backs next for week 4.